So hi everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion on Towards a Net Zero Southeast Asia. This is the final panel discussion before lunch, but as you can see, we have a very esteemed panel on stage with me today, and we're going to take a multi-sectoral deep dive into the reports that was just presented about. So we don't have much time, we only have about 30 minutes. There will be time for Q&A, so do keep a lookout for the QR code that will be flashed on the screen. So Southeast Asia is one of the regions that is most vulnerable to climate change. Lives and livelihoods are at risk from extreme weather events, rising temperatures, and sea levels, and that would also have an impact on the region's GDP. Despite this vulnerability, however, we are seeing the region take more climate action. And as we have heard, the fifth edition of the report that Bain, Temasek, Standard Chartered, and Gen Zero have done have highlighted the different roles for governments, corporates, and investors in this transition. So let's get straight into the Q&A. And Mr. Ngiam, I'm going to put you on the spot by directing the first question to you. One of the key things highlighted in the report is the need for governments to lead with clear transition plans. Singapore has a net zero by 2050 target, and the energy sector, which contributes 40% of our emissions, also has determined that it could reach net zero by that same timeline. Singapore is banking on importing clean generated energy from our neighbours as part of our efforts to reach this goal. And we have heard earlier about how we can accelerate this. We did hear Minister Grace Fu share some insights, but perhaps you would like to chime in as well.
Well, thank you, Audrey, and thank you for having me on this panel. I think it's really important for us to achieve net zero, and most countries in Southeast Asia have all made net zero commitments. I think for electricity imports, it's quite important to put things in the right perspective. So cross-border electricity trading is quite nascent and very limited in Southeast Asia. In November 2021, Singapore announced our plans to import renewable energy from around the region to make up about 30% of our energy mix, about 4 gigawatts of power. In October last year, we announced they've already issued conditional approvals for 4.2 gigawatts worth of electricity import projects. So this means that the projects are commercially and technically viable and have the support of the source countries. Now, how have things moved so quickly? I think one, as what Min Grace Fu mentioned this morning, it's a win-win relationship between the source country and the importing country. Singapore clearly is able to decarbonize our power system with electricity imports, but the source country also benefits because they're able to develop renewable energy resources that will benefit households and businesses in the source country. It's of course commercially viable. We have many companies that are coming to us with proposals, and it's clearly technically and commercially viable for these projects. But there are clearly technical and regulatory issues, and we should not underplay them. Why is this the case? Well, first of all, these are really first-of-a-kind type projects in this region. As I said, cross-border electricity trading is quite limited today. And second, these are very large-scale projects. So a cable from, say, Vietnam is about 1,000 kilometers of high-voltage direct current cables. 2 gigawatts of imports from Indonesia, from solar power, require something like 2,000 hectares of land. So these issues take some time for governments, regulators, policymakers to address. But once we have some projects that have cleared all the hurdles, I believe that the pace of development will accelerate. Notice how today, for cross-border telco cables, they hardly make the headlines anymore. They're just so commonplace. We took several years to negotiate the Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore Power Integration Project. This is the first successful cross-border power electricity trading across 4 Southeast Asian countries. It's working well, and we're already discussing how we can increase the volume of flow and to enable multi-directional trading. I'm quite confident that we will be able to reach a state where cross-border electricity trading is commonplace in Southeast Asia, where cables connect many of the Southeast Asian countries, and where electricity flow is multi-directional and benefits Southeast Asian countries. Then we have achieved our vision of an ASEAN power grid.
Thank you, Mr. Ngiam. And that brings us to what kind of the report also concluded about the value of pilots at scaling climate action across Southeast Asia. So, Secretary Tony, the Philippines also has a target to increase renewable energy generation to 35% by 2030. So the Department of Energy had made a recent decision to allow foreign corporations to enter into service contracts for renewable energy project development, and that is a positive step. Could you share a little bit more about how your department intends to work with the Department of Energy to streamline the regulations and incentivize foreign investments into renewable energy projects, especially those that are taking place on public lands?
Thank you very much for that question. Let me start out by saying that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources is in full support of the Department of Energy's targets, not just for the 35%, but also for the high ambition towards upwards of 70 in 2050. We believe that we are here, in fact, to establish a favorable investment climate and make sure that all the elements come into play. In terms of the issue on public lands and the need to actually address that very quickly, we have been working very closely with the Department of Justice, with the Department of Energy, with the Office of the President and its Secretary for Investment and Economic Development to actually develop solutions similar to previous experience in the Philippines, wherein an offshore gas field was actually established with infrastructure that would run both along the seabed and along land in order to generate and distribute and deliver energy. And those solutions are actually well within our reach at this moment. We are developing those instrumentalities and modalities in order to facilitate investment in these areas. On other supports for the Department of Energy, we actually are part of the Energy Virtual One-Stop Shop. And that actually will allow parallel processing, different agencies in terms of applications and permitting. We are also here to, in fact, update the guidelines for compliance. We have worked very closely with the Asian Development Bank and with the Department of Energy on updating the guidelines for compliance in terms of offshore wind as well as floating solar projects. And finally, we're also here to, in fact, support whatever it is that the Department of Energy will need in terms of the natural resource component. And that actually brings us to various multifaceted concerns, including the need for critical minerals in the transition, and of course, the management of the environmental impacts of these investments. So that would be about the way that we in the Department of Environment are actually focusing on facilitating investments in renewable energy, particularly from foreign investment.
Thank you, Secretary Tony. And I think one thing that we have heard a lot about during the conference so far is about the importance of policymakers setting the direction for financial sector to come in. So, Mr. Gupta, perhaps you could chime in here. Financial institutions are also a key player in the climate finance landscape in Southeast Asia. And as we have heard from the earlier presentation on the report, there are some sizable opportunities to be reaped. But put things in perspective for us. What are the challenges and opportunities that financial institutions face when it comes to advancing decarbonization efforts in the region?
Thank you, Audrey. I sort of warned Chichun, I'm going to just pass the buck to him and say policymakers need to fix it. Actually, but you know, I'm going to think about what can I say which is different from what you just heard from Tim Gold and from Dale. I mean, some of the issues are quite obvious, and let me just recount some of those. Issue number one is that the economics of many of the new technologies are still unproven. This is true for several technologies which are not developed. And if you think about the big carbon emitting sectors, right, for us in the region, it's obviously power, industry, transportation, the agriculture complex, the building complex, etc. In some cases, you have reasonably decent technology solutions, but in other cases you don't. And in some, the solutions which will come in the future, you think of power, it's either hydrogen or fusion or whatever, are just too far out. So there's some real challenges around technology. But even where technology exists, the cost points and the economics of some of the new solutions are not as good as they are for fossil-based energy sources and other such sectors. It's interesting that even in the energy complex, if you compare the cost of production in China or India or Saudi Arabia, where solar efficiency is very high, with the cost of production around the tropics and the equatorial regions, where cloud cover and therefore solar efficiency creates a challenge, you don't get the same economics. And then on top of that, if you add in the cost of land, 2,000 hectares you just talked about, Chichan, and you add the cost of storage, intermittency, and then you layer on the upgrade of the grid to be able to deal with that, the costs are actually can be substantially higher than fossil fuel projects. So there's a comparison thing, I'm going to come back to that point. But in and of itself, several projects, therefore, are not that easy to bank on a pure commercial viability basis. The second big issue is there's a lot of related infrastructure spend that is required. So I can go ahead and do a project, let's say, but if the rest of the investment around the rest of the infrastructure is not in place, I talked about the grid. If you've not upgraded the grid, if you don't have the capacity to instrument, if you don't have the capacity to build a store, that investment is not worth it. So an investment cannot be done in a project by itself without looking at the larger scheme and the larger connectivity issues that need to be resolved. So as a financer now, you got to just look at not just, is this project viable? You got to look at it, is it viable in the context of everything else that is needed to be able to establish the economics that make sense. A third issue, I think Tim talked about before, is for several of the countries in ASEAN, in addition to project cost and project viability, you have a couple of risk premiums that get added on. What are the risk premiums? First, there is sovereign risk premium. Right? And the country risk, many risk ratings of these countries are not great. Many of the countries are not even investment grade. So there is a sovereign risk premium. There's the foreign exchange risk premium. We know from the 1998 crisis and subsequent periods that some of the most volatile and often depreciating currencies are in our part of the world. You know, you saw what happened to the baht and to the rupiah and to the ringgit over a period of time. Most of the funding for these projects is in US dollars, but the revenue realization tends to be in local currency. So you're facing very significant currency risk. So on top of a genuine, you know, what is the underlying technology project, now you got to layer on a currency impact, you got to layer on a sovereign risk impact. The sovereign risk has one nuance to it, which countries could resolve, but it is two, which is offtake. So most project finance happens because you go back and say, who's the off-taker? How much confidence do you have the off-taker will continue to pay you what they agreed to pay when they signed the contract? And because energy in particular, retail energy, is such a political subject that every time there's a regime change and every time there's a new administration, it calls into question whether the arrangements in which you actually did the project will continue to stay the course or not. So there are a whole bunch of different issues which make financing not straightforward. Having said that, I mean, financing is available. We've done $70 billion of sustainable linked financing in the last few years, of which about 10 is renewable, solar, wind, the whole shebang. So it is available, but the cost points sometimes are hard to make work. New solutions are indeed possible. I think blended finance, everybody says, is the new panacea. The reality of blended finance is just, old wine in new bottle. It's a new and elegant way of saying somebody else has to pay for it. And this has been the big problem with most of the time. We say it's a global problem, and yet when it comes to solutioning, we leave it to the countries at the bottom of the pyramid to pay for the solution. After the Kyoto Protocol, the advanced countries are supposed to commit $100 billion a year to be able to fund this global problem. In 30 years, none of that funding came. And because it's not easy if you're an advanced country to put it into your budget, then I'm going to sort of, So now we're saying you don't do it directly, you go and do it through World Bank and ADB and other development agencies. Finally, somebody's going to ante up what it takes to create blended finance. So it's not that easy to resolve either. I mean, it's the right thing to do, not. Carbon markets is another solution. I'm particularly in favor of that because that allows the private sector to actually move money from the north to the south. And therefore, building robust carbon markets might be part of the solution. But I've taken a long time. But just in final comment on it, at the end of the day, the point somebody made earlier is correct. See, for all countries, it's sometimes a hard choice. It's a choice between economic development for the people and sustainability. And if anybody says that there is no compromise or trade-off, they're kidding. Of course, there's a compromise and trade-off. Sometimes there's not, but in the vast majority of cases, you have to make trade-offs. And if you're an elected government of a country with a democratic vote, you have to think about what do my people want? What are they voting me into power for? And therefore, how do I make the trade-off work in a sensible way? That's not easy for a lot of countries. My last comment, I think one obviously good opportunity is what you said, Chuchan. I think the cross-border and export markets are actually quite interesting because they allow countries, source countries, to build capacity, build scale, build technology without having to pay for it because somebody else is buying your power.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gupta, and I think your response really helped to flesh out the real and perceived risks that Mr. Goh talked about earlier in the previous panel about elevating the cost of capital when it comes to certain investments. But I also wanted to pick up on what is said about new solutions. So, Mr. Ngiam, back to you. Perhaps you could share more about the other policy levers that EMA or the Singapore government is tapping to explore some of these emerging technologies.
Well, thank you very much. Piyush is provocative as usual. And I agree with Piyush on many counts. I would just say this in response to Piyush, that renewable energy projects are different in different locations, different situations in different countries, and some have proven to be very investable and very bankable. And as Piyush mentioned at the end, the type of projects that we're talking about across borders, where countries which have plenty of renewable energy resources and prices are relatively low, and countries which lack renewable energy resources are willing buyers, are willing to enter into long-term offtake arrangements which help make these projects bankable. This is a workable and commercially viable model. And this is similar to the approach that we've taken for many different technologies. Right, so cross-border electricity trading, that's a well-established technology. It's deployed across Europe and so on. It's nothing surprising there. But there are other areas, we've mentioned that today, hydrogen, carbon capture, and so on. The Singapore government takes an approach where we set out clearly what our policy and our strategy is for each of these areas. So 2 years ago, as Min Graceful mentioned this morning, we announced our National Hydrogen Strategy. DPM Wong announced that. And that set out quite clearly what our pathways are towards a future where we could potentially adopt hydrogen for power sector, for the industry. And we said that it could potentially make up 50% of our energy mix by 2050. Policy strategy is one, but how do we make it really work? And we recognize that there's always going to be a cost differential for new technologies. Things that are deployed first of a kind, where they are new, where they have not been deployed anywhere else. So Singapore took the approach where we would want to embark on pathfinder projects. We launched a request for proposal for an end-to-end low-carbon ammonia solution, from source to transportation to power generation and maritime bunkering. This is in place now. We are in the process of shortlisting consortiums that we are prepared to work with, to co-fund and work with on pre-FEED studies. And this is the pathway that we've adopted for many of these new technologies. We recognize there's a cost difference. We've also said they're prepared to provide revenue support for these projects to make them commercially viable, bankable, and to make them affordable to off-takers. And we'll adopt this same strategy and approach. Phased approach, but carefully calibrated and working closely with the private sector, with the financial institutions to make many of these transformative projects happen.
Hey, Audrey, can I ask Chichun 2 questions?
Oh yeah, sure.
So first is nuclear. Chichun, in the last few days, it's been in the papers the whole time. So how are you thinking about that? And the second is, how do you balance energy security with these new kinds of things, right? I mean, while we're doing all of this good stuff for renewables, we're still increasing our gas energy thing as well, which for good reason. Sorry, Audrey, but I couldn't sit in the panel with him and not ask him these tough questions.
We could talk separately, Piyush. Well, first, on nuclear, and you've mentioned that the last few days you've heard a lot more about nuclear. But really, to put things in context, way back in 2012, there was a pre-feasibility study that was carried out for nuclear energy in Singapore. And we concluded that that was not ready for Singapore. I know because I chaired that press conference more than 10 years ago. But since then, we've been monitoring technology. It's been developing across the world. There are new forms of technology, Gen 4 type technologies, small modular reactors. There was a whole spread in yesterday's Business Times that talked about how nuclear technology is developing. We've been carefully following these developments. We've been talking to other countries which have deployed nuclear energy to try to understand the constraints, the issues surrounding nuclear energy, and we are building up our own capabilities to better understand that technology, its risks and its rewards. Now, we have not made any decision on nuclear energy. DPM Wong made it very clear in many of his interviews, but we continue to observe this and to be prepared to implement this if this turns out to be viable for Singapore. So it is part of our energy mix. Back in 2022, we put out Energy 2050 committee report. We said that nuclear energy could be part of our energy mix. So we continue to study that, and it's indeed part of our long-term strategy.
Thank you.
On the other point about how do we deal with all these trade-offs with renewables and ensuring there's reliability and low costs, that's essentially the energy trilemma. But how we balance sustainability, cost, and reliability. Now, we're very mindful about this. Our electricity power system in Singapore is one of the most reliable in the world. Everything we do, we ensure that we take care of the externalities. We've put in place energy storage solutions to take care of the intermittency from solar power. It was mentioned by Ko Chap Keong earlier in Semcorp's presentation. And for the electricity imports they're trying to bring in, we will again deal with those externalities with sufficient backups to ensure safe and reliable power system supply to Singapore.
So thank you for that question, Mr. Gupta. I was actually asking him about nuclear just before this panel began. But just a reminder that you still have time to submit questions via the pigeonhole, so please do so. But other than energy, another key area highlighted by the report is the potential for nature-based solutions, especially in Southeast Asia. And we know that the Philippines possesses extensive forests and mangroves and is home to many other very important ecosystems. So perhaps, Secretary, you could share a bit more about what the Philippines is doing and your department's policy direction on attracting investments into nature-based solutions.
Thank you very much. First, allow me to say how much I enjoyed the exchange between the two gentlemen, especially your statements, Mr. Gupta. So thank you for that. Well, in terms of the nature-based solutions and the work of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, I often say that our office is 30 million hectares of land, 15 million of which is actually classified as forests. And within those 15 million, there are great opportunities for reforestation and afforestation, and certainly for the potential for carbon sequestration that can be derived from these activities. So what we've tried to do is really accelerate the finalization of our carbon policy framework. We're working with the World Bank, we're working with the ADB, with the Department of Finance, as well as with organizations like the UNDP to finalize that policy framework, to establish the directions in terms of emissions trading schemes, as well as, of course, possibly carbon tax. We are also looking at voluntary as well as compliance requirements for ourselves and for other countries as well. We are looking at bilateral as well as multilateral consultations regarding these. There are a number of countries that have approached us, and we're very happy to say there's a very dynamic and substantive conversation ongoing with Singapore and the possibility of our pursuing an agreement relative to Article 6 requirements. And finally, I think that it's very important to recognize the role of the private sector in driving this particular dimension of climate action. And so we are working to actually advance certain projects that are already on the pipeline in terms of voluntary carbon market. And we are here, in fact, to encourage a look at the Philippines in terms of both blue and green carbon. And our work is really on maintaining as well as enhancing these ecosystems precisely, not only for community benefit, but of course for the climate mitigation and adaptation opportunities that they can deliver, not just to the Philippines, but to the region.
Thank you, Secretary Tony. And we have a question here. I just wanted to pick up on what you said about adaptation. So perhaps, Mr. Gupta, you could take this. There's a question here about investments in climate resilience and adaptation as part of the transition. Could you share DBS's stance on this?
First of all, I think it's critical because we can be optimistic and assume we can get things right. I'm actually maybe not quite dystopian, but I have to say I think we're going to see some real challenges in coming decades. And therefore, we better focus as much on adaptation and what we can do to prepare for those challenges as we do on the actual transition itself. So for us, these adaptation projects are extremely important to think through. In Singapore, for example, as you know, one of the big adaptation methodology we're thinking about is the rising sea levels. So if the sea levels do rise by a meter or, God forbid, 5 meters, what do we need to do? We're rethinking the way construction is happening, certainly in the East Coast, the low-lying regions. We're making sure HDBs get constructed differently. You look at the airport, Terminal 5, we're constructing it a meter higher. We're trying to do stuff. We're building 2 islands. We're building these whole barriers and dams. All of these are adaptation projects. And so for banks, including for us, these are viable and meaningful projects with which to work with and to finance. Again, you've got to look at it project by project. All projects are not sensible. A lot of them will require fiscal resources and spend from the government as part of a macro budgetary outlay. But where you can track the breadcrumbs to make sure that the funding will be available, I think many of these projects will indeed be bankable.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gupta. Another question here, which perhaps Mr. Ngiam could take. The removal of fossil fuel subsidies is a key part of transitioning the regional energy system to net zero. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I think first, Singapore doesn't subsidize any energy at all. So
we know it.
Yeah. So everybody pays the true cost of energy, and we import almost all our energy needs. So that's the true cost of energy. And not only that, we price in the externalities as well. So as Min Graceful mentioned today, we have a carbon price, and that's only increasing over time based on the trajectory that the government has already put out. So that is the true cost of energy, no subsidies, with the externalities priced in. And as we have talked about it this morning as well, that's one of the key ways in which we can truly price in what it costs to power our systems, to run our industries, and to emit that carbon that's needed for our own development. Only then will we be able to catalyze the development of renewable energy resources, make them bankable, make them viable, make them commercially possible. Then in that way, we're able to catalyze that development across the entire region and bring about the decarbonization that we so badly need in the world and Southeast Asia.
Thank you, Mr. Ngiam. And I think we have time for one final question, which will go to you, Secretary Tony. There's a question here about how the DENR is managing the tensions between renewable energy interests and the need for protected land, such as Masungi, to push sustainability goals.
Well, there are many issues regarding the conservation and protection of protected areas, and not just Masungi. What we need to do is actually begin to balance the need for energy, as well as other types of ecosystem services, with the protection and enhancement of these areas. Inherently, these areas actually provide already mitigation and adaptation benefits and values. And therefore, the need to supply energy, the need to supply food and water needs to be juxtaposed against the sustainable management of not just landscapes, but seascapes as well.
Thank you so much. And please join me in thanking our panelists. I think that's all the time that we have today. So thank you all.